Good morning, everyone. Well, we're here today to look at the cheery subject of death, which is one of my favourite subjects, as you will see, for various reasons. And death records are often one of the most useful group of records for helping you find out more about your family history. Now, when I first started tracing my own family history, like most people, you know, in the excitement of beginning, you want to get back generation after generation. You get your great-great-grandparents, you think, I just want one more generation back and I'll be satisfied. And you get one more generation back and you think, just one more. And so it goes on, generation after generation, unless you hit a brick wall. And this is how we all start. But then at some point, if you're like me, I sort of stood back and thought, hey, this isn't enough. I don't just want a long list of names and dates. I want to know more about my ancestors. I want to get under their skins. I want to know what they were like and what life was like for them. This is family history as opposed to just having a pedigree. And I soon realized that death records very often give us a far better understanding of this than other records such as birth and marriage certificates, etc. Death records can ironically be the ones that shed more light on our ancestors than those records that were actually created during their lifetime. So this is why death records are important. And just think about it. If you don't trace your ancestor's death, you haven't traced his full life, have you? Because very often we trace up to the point where we find an ancestor baptizing his youngest child or perhaps appearing in his last census return. There could be 10, 20 or 30 years after that that we know nothing about. And unless you trace that death, you're missing out on a whole chunk of history. And also, if you don't know when your ancestors died, not only do you not have the full story, if you don't know his death date, can you know whether or not he's the person of that name appearing in records at a later date? So death records really, really are essential. And one of the other things that death records are very, very useful for is they often act as what I call a springboard for finding out further information. They will often give you hints and clues as to other sources you can use, which will then tell you even more about your ancestors. And in some cases as well, partly because of this, they will help you break down brick walls. So death records, really, really important sources, often overlooked by the researcher in their haste to trace the family backwards as far as possible in terms of time. But what do I mean exactly by death records? Well, I've put a few up here on the list for you. Burial records, death certificates, inquest records, obituaries, gravestones, memorial inscriptions, funeral papers, memorial cards, wills, inventories, death duty records, and that old catch-all, other less common records. There wasn't room on the slide for any more. We only have an hour today, so we can't go through them all, unfortunately, but I have written a book and there are further details of the other sources I'm not going to get time to mention in there. And there's also details of much of what I'm going to be talking about today on your handouts as well. So I'm going to give you a flavour today, and what I thought I'd do, I'd look at some examples of people who died. Mostly these are plain ordinary people. They're special to me because a lot of them were my ancestors, but they're not rich or famous. So we're going to start by looking at the good old death certificate. Now, how many of you routinely buy death certificates for your ancestors? And we've got, that's not a bad show of hands, but there's quite a few of you, I'm afraid, who didn't put your hands up there. So you need to pay special attention to this next section because death certificates are a really, really important source and tell us an awful lot about our families. Now, over the course of my other talks during this weekend, I've tended to concentrate on earlier records, but that was probably with the awareness that a lot of you have family who emigrated here at an earlier date. But I thought it'd be a good exercise for those of you who've still got relatives, ancestors, family in the UK after 1837 to look at death certificates. Because although they're expensive, £9.25 currently, they are worth their weight in gold. And even if you don't routinely buy them for your direct ancestors, you should at some point go back and make sure you have got one for each of your ancestors. So we're going to look at a sample death certificate, and the one I've chosen is the death certificate for my ancestor Anne Barnes. And I'm going to work my way through this and look at the different columns and show you how much information you can get if you study the information in detail. So let's work our way through. We're going to start with the place and date of death. Now, Anne died at Knoxbridge Cottages in Staplehurst on the 9th of November 1882. And as you can see from this, she was aged 78. We'll come to that in a moment. Let's look particularly at the place and date of death to start with. You see that abbreviation there? It says Staplehurst RSD. Now, many people get a bit bewildered by some of the abbreviations on death certificates. RSD stands for Rural Sanitary District, and together with USD, Urban Sanitary District, it was simply a local administrative unit at this time. And these were replaced respectively by RD, Rural District, and UD, Urban District, in the 1890s. So if you see those on a death certificate, that's all they mean. It's nothing mysterious or nothing particularly important. Do pay attention to the address on the death certificate. Is it familiar to you from other records, such as census returns? Now, in this case, I'm familiar with this address, very much so, because it's the address where Anne has appeared on every single census return from 1841 up to 1881. So I immediately know that she's died at home. So that tells me she's died at home, probably surrounded by her family. It's given me a picture of her death and of her final hours and possibly her final days and weeks as well. So that is very important to consider that. But in many cases, that address may be unfamiliar to you. And if the address is unfamiliar, well, first of all, check to see if it's the same as the name of the informant, the person who's registered the death. And very often, therefore, it will be a relative's death. But if it's not, do a bit of research into it. Look on the decennial census returns either side of the date of death. Possibly it's a relative that your ancestor was staying with in their last years of their life. But in some cases, there'll even be a bit of mystery attached to the place where they have died. Such was the case with my great-uncle, Uncle Percy Beck. Now, Uncle Percy Beck died when he was in his 30s, and he lived in the East End of London. But I got his death certificate, and I was a little bemused to see that he actually died quite a way away from home at the Shepherd and Dog Inn in Great Stambridge in Essex. So he's died in a pub. And you say, hang on a minute, what's happened here? And you've got this image of great Uncle Percy falling over a little bit, inebriated at the bar. Poor chap. But then you look at the death certificate and you discover he actually died of tuberculosis. I'm thinking, what was going on there? Was he staying with a relative? Were the people running the pub his relatives? And sometimes you don't get any answers. A lot of research has shown that the people running the pub don't appear to have been related to Percy, so perhaps they were just friends and he was staying there to while out his last few weeks or months with the comfort of the local publican. But you have to look into these things and ask questions. Very often, if you're looking at an address on a death certificate, it'll just give a street address, a name and a number, and you'll think, all right, okay, it's just the house address. But bear in mind that certainly from the early 1900s, many workhouses and similar institutions would be recorded on both death and birth certificates just with their street address. And this was to avoid the shame of having your place of birth or death as the workhouse. So try Googling that address. And sometimes if you just put it into a search engine, it will come up and it will be quite clear that it's actually the address of the local workhouse, or it could possibly be a hospital. A very good website to look at if you're interested in following up on possible places and addresses that are actually workhouses is Peter Higginbotham's workhouses.org website. I've put that on the handout for you. It lists all workhouses and where they were and all the surviving records for them as well. Now, sometimes you might discover that your ancestor actually died in a hospital. In that case, I suggest you go to the Hospital Records Database, which can be found on the website of the National Archives. And there you'll be able to find information about over 3,000 hospitals and see what records survive for them. So again, this can be a springboard for you to go and look in other areas and do further research and find out more about your ancestor. You can, of course, also use maps and trade directories to try and find out more about the address where your ancestors died and see if there was some sort of institution located there. If you're using trade directories, remember that these were collated over a period of time, and there's usually a delay of about 6 to 12 months before the information is actually published. So it's a good idea to look at the trade directory for the year before your ancestor actually died, because there's some delay in collecting, getting information out there, or even the year after, I should have said actually there. Now, so that's the place and date of death. The place is then worth following up on, because it can tell you more about your ancestor and what they were doing with the last years of their life and where they were living. Let's move on. Let's look at the occupation. Now, Anne is the wife of Samuel Barnes, labourer. This hasn't told me an awful lot that I didn't know before I bought the death certificates, but in certain cases it can tell you an awful lot. If your ancestor is a man, this is a good way of identifying that you've actually got the right death certificate. You know how hard it is sometimes to find death certificates, because your ancestors, or Samuel Barnes, it's a very common name if you're looking for him, and knowing that you've got the right certificate is very important. But unfortunately, many of our ancestors actually did change occupations. Don't presume that your ancestor would always have been a labourer, for example, if he is in one particular record. He would have taken the opportunity for any better paid work he could have got his hands on. And so you need to use this with a little bit of care. So if you know he's always been a labourer, fine, it's probably the right person. But if, for example, your ancestor was a butcher, but on the death certificate he says he's a draper, don't presume it's not the right person, because many of our middle-class ancestors would have had more string to their bow and would have run local drapers, been an innkeeper, and perhaps also had a butcher's shop as well. And those occupations wouldn't necessarily all have gone there onto the record. So bear that in mind, to use the occupation as an identifier, but also bear in mind it could be different from the occupation in other records. People also in older age would downgrade their occupation as they got older. So one of my ancestors, he was a nurseryman and a florist, but on his death certificate, it's quite clear he was just a jobbing gardener. So he'd taken on lighter duties as he went into older age. The other thing that isn't very reliable on the death certificate, before we move on, of course, is the age. And we saw on the previous slide that when Anne died, she was 78. Now, death certificates and ages, the ages are notoriously inaccurate. And one of the reasons for that is the inaccuracy or the lack of knowledge of the person who actually registered the death. If you go into the registrar's office and register the death of your grandparents, how many of you actually would have known, certainly before you had an interest in your own family history, how many of you would have known exactly how old they were? Maybe these days we would, but certainly back then, few people had an exact idea of how old their grandparents or even their parents were. And people themselves were much less caught up with this idea of birthdays and dates of birth. Many people themselves weren't too sure about just how old they were. So the ages on death certificates, you certainly have to take them with a pinch of salt. But they can, on the other hand, be really useful. Sometimes the age on the death certificate can be your only indicator as to when that person would have been born. And that's very important when you're looking for, especially for a baptism, before the age of birth certificates in 1837. So for those ancestors who were born before the introduction of birth certificates in 1837, and who died before the 1851 census, which is the first to give a reasonably accurate age, the death certificate is very, very important for giving you just an idea of when that person might have been born and when you should be looking for their baptism. So use the age on the death certificate, but use it in tandem with any other sources that give the age. So if your ancestor was alive for later census returns, look and see if there are any discrepancies. You might find when you go to look for the baptism that you're actually looking for a baptism within a range based on the age from a variety of certificates. So the age is useful as well, and we've seen how useful the place the person died can be. So make sure you pay attention to this minute detail as you go through and think about it, question it if necessary, and do further research around it. Now, getting back to the occupation here, we've talked about ancestors changing occupations, but the fact the occupation can, despite that, be a useful identifier that you've got the correct death certificate. Let's look at occupations for women. These are traditionally really unrecorded or under-recorded on many record sources, and death certificates are no exception. You will rarely get an occupation for your female ancestor until you get to the 20th century. For a female, this column is more about her relationship to the nearest man in her life, whether that's her husband or if she's unmarried, her father. And in this case, we learn that Anne is the wife of Samuel Barnes, a labourer. Okay? This is going to help us narrow down Samuel's date of birth, by the way, because, as I said, Samuel Barnes is quite a common name. And even if I know that he dies in between two particular census returns, this is going to narrow down his date of death a little more because we know he was still alive at this point. Looking at women's occupations, I mentioned that you will only get them recorded on death certificates by the early 20th century. But even then, even right into the 1920s and the 1930s, even if that woman had a proper occupation, such as bookkeeper, milliner, etc., they will put that down, but they'll still put in wife of so-and-so or daughter of so-and-so. I've got a few great aunts on my mum's side of my family, and they were spinsters, and they had quite independent lives, and they had their own jobs and their own salaries. But when they died in the 20s and 30s, they were unmarried, and they were in their 60s and 70s. They were still recorded as a daughter of John Stewardson Dickinson, because that was so important. Who was this woman related to? Because men are much more important than women, for the sake of the records, at least. So bear that in mind. So the occupation column can be really, really useful, telling you more about your ancestor and also about their other half, or in some cases even you giving the father's name of an unmarried woman. And of course, if it's a child, you'll get the father's name in there as well. Okay, so let's move on. We're going to look at the cause of death. This, for most people, is probably the most interesting column on the certificate. But ironically, it's the one where people always quote to me and say, well, I'm not going to bother buying the death certificate because, to be quite frank, it will just come back telling me that my ancestors died of senility or senile decay or old age. And yes, some of them do say that, but there's plenty of other useful information on the death certificate, and the percentage of certificates that do just state old age is fairly low. And you can get some very interesting causes of death, and sometimes the causes of death can actually tell you a lot more about your ancestor's life. So this is a particularly vital column. Now, in this case, we learn that Anne has died of, and I quote, a bad leg for 14 years. How can you die of a bad leg for 14 years? We'll come back to that in a minute. And also, added in there as a secondary item is general decay from age as well. It's very important to have an understanding of causes of death, and causes of death particularly on death certificates, because some of them, quite frankly, can be a little bit confusing. Some of the terms sound unfamiliar. Now, for example, typhoid fever and typhus, same thing? Sounds similar, doesn't it? Not the same thing. It's all very, very different. Typhoid fever, the symptoms include septicemia, a rash, and intestinal irritation. And it's spread by contaminated water and food. But if your ancestor died from typhus, the symptoms, by contrast, are headaches and delirium. And it's spread by the bites of ticks and fleas. So though the terms sound similar, they are in fact very, very different. Now, there's a very helpful leaflet entitled Causes of Death and Old Medical Terms, and it's available from genealogyprinters.com, and I've put details of that on the handout for you. It's a really useful little leaflet. I've also put a couple of web addresses on the handout for you, which will help you understand causes of death and terminology. Now, from 1845, a death certificate will state whether or not the certificate and the death was certified by a doctor. And this was part of a general drive by the General Register Office to tighten up on the terminology used on death certificates, because much of it was very vague and it wasn't consistent. So what they decided to do in 1845 was to issue a list of causes of death from which doctors could pick from, basically, when they were certifying a death. But unfortunately, many deaths were simply not certified by a doctor because the family were too poor to call a doctor in. And it wasn't until 1875 that deaths had to be certified by a doctor. So from 1875, there was no death certificate unless the registrar had received a medical certificate from the doctor certifying the death and giving the cause of death. And from this date onwards as well, the doctor was only able to complete this medical declaration if he'd been in attendance on the deceased during his final illness and had seen him either within the last 14 days of his life or immediately after death. And in 1993, this was tightened up even more. The doctor from that point had to have seen the deceased at least twice within the fortnight prior to death, and one of those visits had to have been within the last 8 days. Now, if there was no doctor qualified to sign the medical certificate, then the death had to be notified to the coroner. In many cases, therefore, there would have been an inquest, and we'll look at inquest records shortly. However, despite this attempt to tighten up the terminology used on death certificates and also to make sure that all deaths were certified, some of the causes of death on certificates remain worryingly vague and very confusing right into the early 20th century, and you'll be quite surprised at how vague some of this terminology is. For example, here is the death certificate of baby Elizabeth Kemp, and baby Elizabeth sadly died of teething and convulsions. A child cannot die of teething and it cannot die of convulsions. What we have here are the symptoms. And many causes of death are actually describing the symptoms, not the actual cause of death. Some terminology can sound very scientific, but it actually, if you know what it really means, it only actually emphasizes the doctor's lack of knowledge. And many causes of death are in fact pretty meaningless. Syncope. Syncope sounds good, doesn't it? But all it means is that somebody had a sudden loss of consciousness. That's not a cause of death. Miasma. You've probably seen that on a few certificates. And this refers to the belief that various noxious vapours were in the air and they caused certain types of illnesses. And these certain types of illnesses ranged from bronchitis through to malaria. So I'm afraid if your ancestor died of miasma, you don't really know what caused his death. Dropsy, you will have seen on quite a few. Again, this describes the symptoms of death, not the cause. The symptoms would have been large levels of fluid retention, which would have left the patient extremely uncomfortable, often affected the legs and the internal organs. Sometimes the lungs would have been affected as well, and then your ancestor would have struggled to breathe. But the actual cause of death was more likely to have been heart failure or disease of the kidney. So if you see dropsy in certificate, that's probably it's going to be one of those causes of death. And the old favourite, visitation of God. Yes, we've got that one there. This is the doctor saying, gosh, that was sudden, wasn't it? Don't know what killed him. And it's probably going to be a heart attack or a stroke, but to be honest, you can't really be certain. But it is very important to read between the lines of these causes of death. Many deaths attributed to bronchitis when the patient didn't actually have a bronchitis, but this is how it was diagnosed by the doctor. And if you see that your ancestor's death has been recorded as bronchitis, especially if they have died at a relatively young age, do look at their occupation. What is it? Are they working with in any sort of job or industry where they would be inhaling any sort of particles? So ancestors working in a mill would be inhaling threads of cotton and dust. Ancestors who were glass workers would be inhaling parts of silica. And this is actually an occupational death. It's caused by their work environment. And we, looking back 150 plus years later, whatever, have often a better understanding of what caused that person's death than the doctor did at that moment in time, because at that time they didn't understand about how certain industries could affect people's health. And so if you see that, especially if it says the bronchitis has lasted for more than 6 weeks, that is probably the case. And it's also going to tell you a bit about your ancestor's general health in the years before he or she died as well. It wouldn't have been great. Now, let's go back to Anne Barnes's death. Bad leg. What could it be? She may well have suffered from osteoarthritis or possibly varicose veins. That would fit in with her being the wife of a labourer. She's standing on her feet all day. She's doing a lot of carrying. It's going to be a hard life for her. But what I think is key here is the fact it's 14 years. It's not 10 years, 5 years, 15 years, 14. That's very specific, isn't it? I think that Anne had an accident. There was an injury to her leg. And that as she got older, her leg became ulcerated because of this injury, and it hastened her death, together with her old age and the fact she'd had a hard life. Now, I'm reading between the lines, but I'm probably fairly accurate, I suspect. The other thing you need to do is to think about how this affected her in the 14 years leading up to her death. Don't just stop and go, oh yeah, interesting, died of a bad leg, put that into my family tree program. She's a real woman. She was alive. She suffered with this injury or affliction for 14 years. It was a hard life anyway, and this would have made it a lot harder. It would have also had a knock-on effect on her family, who would have had to have helped out more. So her disability would have affected the whole family and probably made her life, I would suggest, fairly miserable at times. Let's hope she had a cheerful personality to counter it. But by reading between the lines like this and studying the detail, certainly for me, this was the moment when Anne became a real person. And this is the irony about death records. They can really bring your ancestor's life. She was no longer just a name and a date on my family tree. She became a living, breathing person with all her problems and issues. So I think that really is one of the beauties of some of these records. Now, let's move on. The name of the informant in this column can be very, very useful, of course, because very often it's a relative. And if there is a relationship there, it should be stated from 1875 onwards. It won't always be. A lot will depend on whether the informant thinks they're related. If they're a second cousin, that relationship may not be described because the second cousin would just have said, no, I'm not related, because he was thinking, I'm not son, daughter, husband, whatever, etc. So, take it with a pinch of salt. Before 1875, there won't be a relationship there, so you'll have to do a bit of work trying to work out whether there is a relationship, but that's well worth doing. Now, of course, if you're getting the name of a daughter like you are here, it says Esther Smith, a daughter, very useful because it's giving you the name of a daughter and it's giving you her married name. But this was specifically useful for me here because I knew Samuel and Anne had 11 children, but I had not found any baptism or birth entry for Esther. She was the missing youngest 12th child whose record just didn't appear. So if I hadn't bought this death certificate, I would never have discovered that there was this extra daughter. And if you look at her address, she is also living at Knoxbridge Cottages. So she's actually living 2 doors down from Mum and Dad. She's the one that's there in Anne's later life to help her around the house with her bad leg. And if you'll note also, she is present at the death. She may not actually have been physically by the bedside, but she would have been there in the house. You'll also see the terms in attendance, which means somebody wasn't present but they'd been looking after the deceased in their last illness. And from 1875, you'll occasionally see the term causing the body to be buried. And that usually indicates somebody who had no family or no family close at hand. And it's very often the case when somebody died in a workhouse or institution, or perhaps died when they were lodging with someone else. There was no family around, and someone else took on the responsibility for organising their funeral and burial. So let's summarise. What have we learnt from Anne's death certificate? Was it worth buying it? It's £9.25. It tells us when, where and what she died of, and that's really, for me, helped to bring her to life. It's giving us her marital status at death, which helped identify her husband's death. The age of death helped me locate her baptism, and by the way, her maiden name was Anne Davis, so there were quite a few Davis baptisms to sort out, so that was very, very useful. It's given me new information on her later life, and it's told me about the disability she had, and I've also located her youngest daughter, and when I looked in the census returns, I found they were just living next door, and I found her husband's name and the names of Esther's 4 children as well, so I could add them to my family tree. So I don't know if you agree, but I think it was well worth buying that certificate. Now, one record of death often leads us to another. And though the majority of our ancestors would have died quietly at home in their beds, like Anne did, unfortunately, before the age of health and safety, counselling, credit cards, many of our ancestors died either in accidents or sadly because they took their own lives. And you'll be amazed at the number of people who didn't die quietly in their beds. And these include your ancestors and your ancestors' siblings. I found quite a few of these instances with my own family. Now, if we look at some statistics, the annual report of the Registrar General in 1866 defined that over 15,000 deaths had occurred because there was some sort of accident or negligence. 1,329 were recorded as suicide. But that second figure, I can tell you, is an underestimate, because if somebody did commit suicide, it would only be recorded as such if it was clear-cut. So if somebody slashed their throat, okay, it's suicide. But if somebody's found drowned, we can't prove it's suicide unless they left a note. And most inquest juries would try not to pass a verdict of suicide because of the shame it put onto the family, because it annulled any insurance policies. They would not go there unless there was actually evidence beyond doubt that that person had actually taken their own life. As mentioned earlier, from 1875 then, a doctor could not certify a death unless he'd seen the patient in their last illness and within 14 days of death or immediately after the death. Now, that means that any doctor who didn't fulfill those criteria, nobody could sign a death certificate. So it would apply if I suddenly drop down dead now. Certainly if I were in the UK, there'd need to be an inquest, because I'm not sensibly ill, nobody knows why. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a suspicion of foul play. It can just be somebody dropping dead for no good reason or no known reason. And if the death is like that, or if there is any reason for it to be suspected there could have been some foul play, or if there's an accident, so if the roof suddenly falls in on me and it wipes me out, hopefully you'll be okay. But there will be an inquest to determine the cause of death. And though it's very sad for our ancestor that they've died in that manner, it's good news for you. It's fantastic, because if there is an inquest record, you're going to get so many more details about your ancestor, potentially his life, his family, as well as his last hours and what led up to his death. Now, from 1875, the death certificate will not only tell you the name of the coroner who presided over the inquest, it will also tell you when that inquest took place and where it took place. Before 1875, the coroner's name will go down on the death certificate as the informant, but it won't tell you where or when the inquest took place. Now, survival rates for inquest records do vary greatly, I'm afraid. because these documents weren't actually protected by law until the 1920s. But where records survive, they're usually most comprehensive by the time you get into the 19th century. The best way to start, if you're looking for inquest records, certainly from the 1850s onwards, is to see if you can locate a report in the local newspaper. And as I mentioned yesterday, there is this wonderful British newspaper archive.co.uk, now online, which you can use to look not just for any newspapers, but specifically for inquest reports. And that is also available via Find My Past. And while the British newspaper archive is not comprehensive, it's not every newspaper that's ever been published, the coverage is pretty evenly distributed around England and Wales. So you've got a good chance of finding something if you look there. Let's just have a look at a brief example. This is from Welsh newspapers online, and this gives you a flavour of what you could get. So this is a fairly brief example. Some are much, much longer than this. February 1845, inquest on Friday. An inquest was held on at the Shoulder of Mutton, that's the pub. They tended to hold inquests in pubs. It was a good thing to do, not just because it was a gory subject, because it was very convenient. So the inquest was held at the Shoulder of Mutton before Lewis Rees, Esquire, on the body of Richard Mason, nailer of this town. And it would appear from the evidence that about Christmas last he had 2 fits and afterwards became asthmatic. That about a fortnight ago his cough got better and he occasionally went to work, and that on Tuesday the 4th he felt unwell and went to bed, and on Thursday he died. They're always very matter-of-fact about it. The coroner stated that he had seen Mr. Edward Evans, who attended him, who said he had a diseased heart for some time and no doubt it would cause a sudden death. Verdict: died by the visitation of God of a diseased heart. So it's not telling us anything revolutionary, and this one doesn't give an awful lot of detail about the deceased, but it does tell us that he had been ill for a while and he had heart problems. So that is useful information there, and it's probably more than you would have got on the death certificate. So apart from the newspaper reports, you can also, of course, see if there are any actual inquest records that survive. From the mid-18th century onwards, these will be at county record offices. And in my talk yesterday afternoon, we looked at how to access records in the UK, even if you can't go there, by using a local researcher. And if you didn't pick up a copy of that handout, handouts are still available today, I believe. Now, the actual inquest records themselves will sometimes give a greater detail than the report in the paper. And there's various different types of inquest records that you can find. The general one, the main one, is called the Inquisition. And these are particularly useful before 1837, prior to death certificates. They are a summary of the findings of the coroner. Now remember, the coroner, when he presided over an inquest, he would preside over an inquest and be assisted by a jury. And the jury would help him in deciding what actually happened and what the cause of death was. The coroner would guide them in their final decision, but it would be the jury that would be weighing up the evidence to work out why somebody died. And on the Inquisition, you get details of when and where the person was died or where the body was found. You'll get the names of all the jury members down here, and then you'll get the final verdict on the cause of death there. So that's the inquest or the Inquisition. But there are other records you can find as well. You can find supporting evidence, documents produced to show how and why somebody died. And these can be really interesting. And also witness depositions. These are witness statements saying, they'll tell you the story of the person's last hours from people who met them within their last hours, from people who knew them very well. And sometimes these witness depositions can give you so much detail about your family. There'll be things there, information there, that you won't find in any other records. Details of the person's daily routine, how they always walked to work this particular route, or they always went to gather their hen's eggs first thing in the morning, etc., etc. You can also get details of what was found in their pockets. One inquest record I looked at many years ago, it actually gave details of a particular person and stated that he and his wife had been separated for 2 years. Now, they never got divorced, of course, but without that inquest record, I would never have known that that happened to that couple. So they can be really, really fantastic records. Now, I first discovered the beauty of inquest records many years ago regarding a case relating to my own family tree. Now, let me tell you a little bit about my family. The Barnes family lived in South London, and my ancestor was Edwin Barnes, and he married Sarah Ailey. Edwin was born in 1845 in Staplehurst in Kent, and the family moved to London. Edwin worked as a wine cellarman. They had 3 children. Now the youngest, the girl, she was born in Wales in 1875, so at some point they'd been down to Wales, presumably for work, but they'd come back again. And in 1881 they were there safely in South London on the census returns, Edwin working as a wine cellarman. And there, this was many years ago when I was just a young girl, I left that family there, presuming there was nothing more to find about them. I wrote them off as just, okay, I've done that. And then when census returns started coming out on CD-ROM, I bought myself the 1901 census for London as a treat, and I was scrolling through these CDs, and shock horror, I discovered young Mary Ann Barnes in a home for fatherless girls, aged 11. I'd never bought the death certificate for Edwin or Sarah. Big mistake. I hastily ordered that certificate and waited with some trepidation to see why Edwin died. You could see from the death index he died at a relatively young age. His cause of death was inflammation of his lungs following a blow on his eye from a box. Another strange cause of death for the Barnes family. Now, how could that have happened? And you can see certificate received from W. John Payne, the coroner for Southwark, inquest held 6th of January 1883. Now, sometimes the coroner would decide after a post-mortem there was no need for an inquest, and if so, that would be stated on the certificate as well. But in this case, there certainly is a need for an inquest, quite clearly. I contacted London Metropolitan Archives, and luckily the actual inquest records did survive, including several witness statements. They were very hard to read because as the clerk was writing, he'd been going faster and faster, and his writing was atrocious. But I managed to decipher them, and I can tell you this story. One morning, about a week before Christmas in 1882, Edwin set off for work as usual. He worked at Martin Company Wine Merchants and Exporters in London, which is now on the site of where Borough Market is, if you know it, in Southwark. Now, Martin Company, their address was 3 Crowns Square at this point. And Edwin's walk from 1 Susanna Place, where he lived with his family, it took him about 20 minutes to get there. So he set off for work, and when he returned home for lunch that day, his wife, Sarah, said to him, "Edwin, what's wrong with you? You've got a bandage round your head. What's happened?" And he said, "Well, I was working in the wine cellar, and one of my colleagues was lowering this big, it was empty, but a big wine cask down from above, and it swung out and it hit me on the head." "Oh dear," she said. "Oh well, you don't look too bad." Off he went back to work after lunch, as you did in those days. You'd just been hit in the head with a wine casket, go back to work. Amazing. But a few days later, Edwin felt very ill, and he took to his bed. He developed a fever, and his temperature soared. Sarah, they weren't a well-off family, but Sarah was so worried about him, she called in a doctor called Mr. Gittins to attend to him all week for suspected bronchitis. But he got worse. Sarah got so worried about him, she actually forked out for another doctor, and a doctor called Dr. Boney came to see him. And sadly, Dr. Boney was too late, and Edwin died a few days before Christmas. But before he died, he had a raging temperature of 106 and was spitting phlegm. He was delirious. The witness statements, there were witness statements from colleagues and from the doctors, and we have 2 slightly contrasting witness statements from his colleagues, one of whom, the one who was lowering the case, said it swung out. He was doing it right, but it swung out. Edwin falls to the ground, and one of the colleagues says he wasn't stunned, but another one says he was stunned, he couldn't answer to his name, and then they patched him up, basically, and he actually describes it as they patched him up with sticking plaster. which is interesting. But the cause of death was decided to be from internal bleeding, basically, because the blow to the head had caused internal bleeding, which had led to inflammation of the lungs. And these days, he would have survived, but sadly, not back in 1882. Now, I know so much detail about Edwin and his family. I know where he lived, I know where he worked, I know how long it took him to get to work, I know about the 2 doctors who attended him. I know so much detail, and this all comes as a result of the inquest record because it's got such a lot of detail in it. And also because I was able to use that as a springboard, I went to looked up those doctors' names, the General Medical Council records that are on Ancestry, to see just how well qualified they were. They were both qualified doctors. I was a bit dubious about the Mr. Gittins one, but he was qualified. I was able to locate 3 Crown Square on old historic Ordnance Survey maps and find out it was on the site of the present-day Borough Market. I had another address for the Barnes family because this was in between census returns, one Susanna Place that I didn't know of. And because he died in this manner, and it is tragic because it split the family asunder, and there's more details about it in the book if you wish to read more, but for me it means I know an awful lot more about them than about various other members of my family. So I won't say pray that your ancestors died a nasty death, but if they did, take full advantage of it. Now, an increasingly useful source for family historians are gravestones and memorial inscriptions, especially for you being overseas, because while many of these monuments that still remain in the churchyards are decaying at the rate of knots and rapidly becoming illegible, many, many more are being preserved photographically and digitally, and these databases, together with burial databases, are now going online. So I thought it would be a useful exercise to take a brief look at gravestones, get outside for a bit, go into the churchyard, and just remind ourselves how useful these can be. And bear in mind that, yes, our poorer ancestors wouldn't have had them, and stones obviously decay quite rapidly, but those that remain are very well worth seeking out. Causes of death on gravestones. You'd be amazed at how many do actually give the cause of death. And this one of my favourites, is to Agnes, the wife of Francis Atkinson, who died of childbed in 1812. And she was 34. This, of course, is before 1837, so we would not have known the cause of death. We might have suspected it was childbirth, but this actually tells us and confirms possibly our suspicions. Especially in coastal parishes, you'll often get gravestones with causes of death from seamen and sailors and people being washed up on the shore. So do look out for these. They're very, very interesting. Gravestones are also a good source for occupation. And here we've got Thomas Piper, who died in 1819. Not only does it give us his full date of birth and date of death, but details of his wife and son, but it tells us that Thomas Piper was a plumber. So it's not anything a terribly high status occupation, it's fairly run-of-the-mill, but it is there. And sometimes gravestones can take us back to a really early date. This example here is from the Isle of Man, and it's Sarah Kellip. She died on August 14th, 1758, aged 38, which takes her birth back to the early 1700s. I have actually got a really, really early stone, but it's not a very good picture. But it's in the 1630s this person died, and they were in their 50s, so it actually gets us back into the 1500s. And that's just a nice feeling when you see something like that. It's fantastic. Now, recording gravestones is nothing new, and the older the transcription or recording obviously is better because there would have been more stones standing and they would have been easier to read. It's important to remember as well to investigate your ancestors' siblings. If you really want to understand the lives of your family, you need to look not just at your direct ancestors, but your ancestors' wider family as well. Otherwise, you won't be getting the whole picture. So do find out what happened to your ancestors' siblings. Check to see if you can find burial or death entries for them. You may get clues, such as children being given the same name. Presumably then the first one has died. So don't presume that your ancestors, if you can see from the baptism registers, there's 10 siblings for your ancestors. Don't presume your great-great-great-grandfather actually grew up with 10 siblings, many of them may have died. And even if you see a child being baptised with the same name as an earlier child, don't presume the first one has died, because the earlier you go back, especially by the time you get to Tudor and Stuart times, people did tend to give younger children the same name as the older ones, just in case the older ones died. I've got a will for a family, and it says, my name is John Zakri, and I'm leaving so-and-so, so-and-so to my brother, John Zakri. He had a brother called John, did John. It's very confusing sometimes. Now, do also see if you can marry your ancestors off, because this is an interesting project to see if people married brothers and sisters, to see if your siblings and your ancestor actually kept in touch with each other through their lives. This is all about understanding family history and not just having names and dates. Now, here's my little portion from my family tree. Charles Chapman Heritage married Elizabeth Clements. Now, according to baptism records, my ancestor, who's William Clements, had sister Elizabeth, brother Charles, sister Mary Ann, and a sister called Helen. Now, I did work out that Helen died as a baby because I found her in the burial records, and also Charles. But I've mentioned that the older the graveyard survey is, the better. And if you were at my talk yesterday, I mentioned a fabulous parish scrapbook that I found in this village of Aston Cantler where my family lived, and where the vicar had gone round and recorded all the gravestones. And because I found this entry in the parish scrapbook, it's a recording of my great-great-grandmother's gravestone. And it says, "Sacred to the memory of Elizabeth, wife of Charles Chapman Heritage, who departed this life the 13th of December 1822, aged 33. Also 3 children of the above, Charles," okay, we've got him, Elizabeth, we had her, but also Anne, who died in their infancy. Now, there's no Anne recorded in the baptism registers or the burial registers. It's not Mary Ann, she survives and she lives on. So the only record we have for this baby who died, who was my ancestor's sibling, is this record here on this parish scrapbook entry. So if the vicar hadn't done this, we would never have known about the existence of this child, because she's just not there in the parish registers. And the other interesting thing is here there's a note saying that by 1869, that particular gravestone was no longer standing, so it didn't even last very long at all. So it's very important to realise there may be omissions in parish registers and to look at other sources, such as memorial inscriptions, which can sometimes fill in certain blanks in your family tree. So we can now revise our family tree and add in Anne, and then we need to make sure we're aware of the ones that died. So in effect, my ancestor William only grew up with 1 sibling. It's a totally different story. If we hadn't followed up by looking at death records, we would have thought he grew up with quite a few brothers and sisters to play with. But no, just Mary Ann, and Mary Ann and William stayed in close touch throughout their lives. They were clearly quite close, probably because of that fact. So while many of our ancestors wouldn't have had gravestones, it's well worth looking for them and looking for memorial inscriptions. And in my book, and also in the handout, I have put some suggestions for websites where you can pick up recordings of memorial inscriptions. And as I say, it's a growing area, and there's more and more coming online. I've mentioned that death records are very good springboards for other sources, and one particular good source are obituaries. Don't presume that because your ancestor wasn't rich or famous, there won't be an obituary for them. It's not necessarily the case, as we shall see. They can cover both rich and poor, especially where that poor person was newsworthy. So it could be somebody dying because they've reached the ripe old age of 101, or it could be somebody who's not very well off, but they've done a lot of benevolent work in the local community, so they do get an obituary. So do look for them no matter whether you think your ancestors are poor or rich. And remember what I said yesterday as well, don't make presumptions about your ancestors' wealth or status unless you know for sure. Now, obituaries obviously will be found in local newspapers, but it's not really until the 1850s that we find local newspapers really get going in terms of covering local news, as opposed to just copying news that came down from London. Before the 1850s, Most provincial papers were run as a sideline by local printers, and many of the obituaries we will find were inserted by them. For example, if you look here, we can see down the bottom here, this clearly says, at Woodhead, Catalan near Penrith, Margaret Turnbull, aged 19, sister to the youth whose death we mentioned a fortnight ago. This is inserted by the printer. It's not been inserted by the family. Up here, he's chosen to report the death of my ancestor, Edward Dickinson, which is very useful for me. Tells me he suffered a long illness, but he bore it with Christian patience, that he was a miller, and he was an honest dealer in his business dealings. It also tells me he left a wife and 8 children. Useful information. Didn't always get it right. Edward only had 7 children, unless I've missed one, of course. I mentioned poorer people having obituaries. From the 1850s, you start to get proper obituaries written by reporters. And here we've got one from my great-uncle, John William Wilson. And I'm not going to read it all out, but it tells us details of when and where he's worked, the work he's done, which is very useful. It's telling us details of what sort of person he was, details of his early life, born at Twickenham. Again, I'm afraid that is a mistake. He was actually born several hundred miles further north in the Cumbria, but he moved down to Twickenham at an early age. So again, take it with a pinch of salt. The reporter would probably have asked somebody who would have said, oh yes, he was local, he was Twickenham, but he wasn't actually born there, so do be a little bit careful. But it also tells us he came to Ilford to cover the Old Blues sports ground. He was a gardener, so he worked and was groundsman at the Old Blues sports ground in Fairlop. He was also well known for the good work he did as Secretary of the Barkingside HSA and for the National Old Age Pensioners Association. He did a lot of benevolent work as a member of the Buffaloes, and that's why he's getting this several paragraph obituary here. And here's another springboard. The Buffaloes is a friendly society. They have their own archive, their own records, so I can then go and ask if I can see those records and probably find out even more information about old John William Wilson there. Sometimes obituaries will even have photographs, and that is very, very lovely to find. Now, it's important that you use your death records in tandem. It's important to do this because although each record is ostensibly covering the same event, your ancestor's death, each will give a slightly different angle on that death and may well add further information to what you already know from another death record. So do look for them all. One death record can also help you locate another death record that is proving hard to find as well. And this is increasingly the case as more and more databases go online. For example, if you can't find that missing burial entry, perhaps the burial took place in an unexpected parish, or perhaps you're looking at the wrong year for some reason. If you can't find it, go and look for a memorial inscription. And if that's been picked up and put online, that will help guide you towards the correct burial, because you'll have the place of burial and the date of burial. And that works vice versa as well. Notably too, if you can't identify the correct death in the General Register Office Index of Deaths, there are potentially plenty of other death sources to help you locate it. So for a missing General Register Office Death Index entry, look for more memorial inscriptions online, look for burial registers, and also use the Principal Probate Registry Index from 1858 onwards, which is online at Ancestry and the UK Government's Probate Search Facility website. Now, obviously, not all of our ancestors would have probate entries, but where they did, they can be particularly useful. Here's this one here, and in this entry, we can see Elizabeth Heritage. It tells us she was late of Kenilworth in the county of Warwick, spinster, deceased, and she died the 13th of August 1809 at Bethlehem Hospital in Surrey. So we can then zone in. I mean, she's come from Kenilworth, so perhaps we couldn't find her death because we were looking in Kenilworth, which is in Warwickshire, but she actually died in a hospital in London, in Surrey. So having this information, we can then go back to the death index and hopefully find the death certificate entry there and buy the certificate. You'll see the probate index gives a lot of useful information. It gives the name of the executors of this estate as well, and you can actually sometimes build up mini pedigrees just by looking at the Principal Probate Registry Index here. And also people who didn't leave wills, but where there were letters of administration for people to administer the estate after their death, there will also be entries in this index. So it's one other source for you to go out and think of using in a slightly different way if you haven't done so already. Another source you may not be familiar with are death duty records. Have you ever thought of using them? Now, these are often overlooked because you think death duties, oh, they're for the rich ancestors, aren't they? My family wouldn't have been subject to death duties, but it's not the case in actual fact. Death duties is a blanket term used to describe several different taxes levied on people after their death. And let's have a look at a few basic facts about them. Right, the coverage dates for the records is 1796 to 1903. And bear in mind that by 1857, these death duties affected all estates over the value of £20. Freehold land was included from 1853, and obviously that's quite key because it's going to boost the value of the estate. Before 1853, it wasn't counted. Now, death duty records are going to provide you with details about the deceased, but also executors and beneficiaries. And very importantly, they will name the probate court which dealt with the grant of probate or administration. And that is often a shortcut for helping you find a will, because there's many different probate courts where wills could be proved. If you find the death duty and they've been indexed, so it's easy to find one, it will tell you where that will be. They will also indicate the value of the estate at the time of death, which can be quite different from the value when the person wrote a will, usually gone down. Bear in mind, there was no duty on estates passed between spouses, children, parents or grandparents of the deceased up until 1805. They started hacking away at this exemption, understandably, the government did. This was reduced to spouses and parents only from 1805, from 1815 spouses only, and that is how it remains at present. Now, these records can be of great use to you, so where are you going to find them? And then we'll go on and look at a short case study to finish. The originals are held at the National Archives in Kew in London, and the class number is IR26, and hopefully if you attended my session yesterday, you'll know what I'm talking about when I say class number. But there is also an index of death duties, and the easiest way to access this is at findmypast.co.uk, and you can carry out a name search. The death duty records are also available online, the actual records, some of them, on the National Archives website for the wills that were proved everywhere apart from the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, which is the majority of wills. So there's a good chance you'll be able to download these records online, but that digitisation project only went up to 1811. For records after this date and those PCC wills, you can hire a researcher, hire a member of the Association of Genealogists and Researchers in Archives, because they've been vetted, certainly the full members have been vetted, or get a researcher on the National Archives listing to go to the National Archives and photograph that document for you. Or you can ask for the National Archives staff to copy a document for you. They will give you a quote. It could be fairly expensive. It's probably easier to get somebody to go there for you. Okay, so I've said these records are very useful for you, and they're particularly informative for genealogists in the case that the deceased was unmarried and died intestate, so without making a will. Because in that case, his estate will have been divided between his relatives according to a strict formula set by the government. Usually this would be his siblings, but sometimes it could be his cousins. And in this case, the record's going to provide you with lots and lots of information about the wider family. So this shows, again, it really pays to research your ancestors' wider family. Now, letters of administration granted if somebody died without making a will would authorise a next of kin to distribute the estate, but they themselves contain very, very little detail. But if you get hold of the DDR for a relative who's died intestate and who doesn't have heirs, you can get an extensive pedigree, basically. Let me show you what I mean. And if you want to read up about this further, I've put details of a very useful National Archives research guide on the handout for you. A few years ago, I was working for a client, and she was trying to fill in gaps in her family tree and match various branches of her family tree together. And her family was actually based in Scotland. But she turned up following reference in a will. The will was for her relative Isabella Oliver in 1860. And in Isabella's will, it stated that she'd received 1/11th part or share as one of the next of kin of Andrew Davidson of Woolwich. So here's a bit of a clue. Now, further research showed that Andrew had died on the 31st of May 1858 in Charlton, Woolwich, South London. He was aged 58, and it turned out, looking at census returns and other records, that he actually had mental health issues and was in the care of a local family who were looking after him. He was also clearly quite well off, and because of this, there were letters of administration. There was quite a lot of estate to be handed out. I was able to locate his death duty register index, and from this, I learnt so much about my client's family and was able to plug lots of gaps for her. This is an extract from the actual death duty. I couldn't get the whole thing on because they're massive documents, but I won't work through each column in turn, but let me just tell you, it will start off by giving details of the deceased, their address, their occupation. Then it will give you details of the people dealing with the estate, the executors if it's a will, the administrators if it's administration. Then in the case of this, because it's going to name the beneficiaries, it's going to list everyone who was entitled to a share of Andrew's estate as his relative. And the great thing in this case is that Andrew was an only child, so the estate is going to go to his cousins. There was no surviving elder relatives. And you will get a list of beneficiaries, and you'll get details of how they are related to your ancestor. Now, the death duty record makes you do a little bit of homework, because it will define that relationship by means of a code. So we learn that the beneficiaries were James Chisholm, a carrier of Selkirk in North Britain, that's Scotland, who's a DSF. Thomas Hagg, Jr., of Elwick Terrace of Selkirk, a designer, DSF, so on and so on. Anne Young, Christina McGregor, DSF, DBF, DSM. You probably won't remember what I'm going to tell you. That's why you need to go and look at the National Archives Research Guide, because it lists all these consanguinity codes. But you can work it out from that, and DSF means descendant of a sister of the mother of the deceased. DBF is descendant of a brother of the father of deceased, and DSM is descendant of a brother of the mother of deceased. You might have a bit of work to do around that, but it's a massive, massive clue for you. That's one source then that you may not have thought about. And I'll say the DDRs, as we call them, they are indexed on Find My Past, and you can search Find My Past. You only have to subscribe when you want to go in and look at a record. So do go and have a look and see what you can find out about that. Now, what else have I got to tell you? We've run out of time. I could go on all day about death records. I will just mention inventories. I'm not going to go into detail, but if you find there is an inventory accompanying your ancestor's will, do read it, because inventories are the next best thing to a time machine, and they'll actually let you walk around your ancestor's house room by room and give you an idea of what he had in there. But I will leave details of that for another lecture, and I know Paul is going to be looking at inventories in his talk, I think shortly after mine, so he will no doubt cover some of that. So there again are those consanguinity codes, and they are on the National Archives Research Guide for you. Yes, if you want to buy a copy of my book on death records, the one on the left, it's available via Pen and Sword's website or Amazon, either as an ebook or in paper. And this is the one, my one I haven't written yet, so I'll be rushing back to go and do that shortly. Yes, it'll be out probably about 2020. Don't hold your breath. Don't forget, if you want other details of other talks, webinars, online videos, etc., and rounds up of genealogical database releases to the internet, I do a newsletter every 3 or 4 months, and you can sign up to that from my website at www.chfh.co.uk, and there's also a YouTube channel you can subscribe to as well. Thank you very much.